Audio test, 1, 2, 3. How is it back there? You guys hear me? And I see a student volunteer that back there. You hear me okay? All right. So I'm going to start. And I know it's pretty much dark 30 for the SIGGRAPH crowd. So thanks for all coming out. This is your daily session on SIGGRAPH History 101B. There will be a quiz. So the JPL Graphics Lab couldn't accurately be called a legend in computer graphics history. We didn't know it at the time because we were just way too busy. The reason that we're doing this is because the lab started operations in July of '77. There's some history that predates it, but we're commencing the talk or the presentation on July '77 because that's when we started. Jim and I got to the lab and we started doing things. So I thought last year it'd be a good thing to time this panel for the 40th anniversary. The lab continued after 1990, but it was continued administratively. The essence of what was called the JPL Computer Graphics Lab had dissipated by then. It would not be possible to talk about this lab without talking about Bob Holzman. He was the one who conceived of the lab. He pushed it, he got funding for it, he got equipment installed, he got people installed in the lab working, and furthermore, he kept us all insulated from the federal bureaucracy. This is no small thing. Now that I've been a NASA senior scientist, I know what machinations Bob was going through in order to keep us away from this stuff. Now, unfortunately, Bob couldn't be with us today, so we have his avatar here. Some words of explanation before we start the real material. The Jet Propulsion Laboratory is a NASA facility operated under contract by the Caltech Institute of Technology. So you'll see these three terms thrown around interchangeably, NASA, JPL, and Caltech. But as a matter of fact, we were all Caltech employees, although we were working mostly on NASA projects. The other thing to keep in mind is that you will hear PS2 very frequently this morning. And I need to explain, this means Evans and Sutherland Picture System 2. It does not mean PlayStation. So keep that in mind. Today's lineup, first we'll have Jim Blinn talking about all of the marvelous work that he's done. I'll talk about some of the other things that were done at the lab. The illustrious David M. will talk about the work that he did at the lab. And then we'll have videos from Sylvie Roof, who was an engineer during the later years of the lab. So now it gives me great pleasure to introduce one of my mentors, Dr. James F. Blinn.
I want to start out by showing a few slides. Here's one. And here's another one. These slides are actually dated 1977, and I thought originally it might be fun to get an actual slide projector in here since this is a history panel, but then sanity returned and I scanned them all in. So, when I was very young, my first career aspiration was to be an astronomer. And I went to the library and got all the astronomy books I could find, and one of them had a chapter on Jupiter. And in there was a chart of the Galilean satellites showing the radius and the orbital distance and the orbital period. And I remember lying in bed at night thinking, I know there's something interesting you can do with these numbers, but I don't know what it is. Well, a little bit later on, I was inspired by Disney films like Man in Space and the Bell Science movies to try to go out and do some of my own educational animations using paper cutouts and an 8mm movie camera, which didn't work very well. Ultimately, I wound up at the University of Michigan, and I attached myself to a project that had a computer graphics display. And I'm going to, there we go. There we go. And I started doing educational animations on that, which very few people saw until today. This is electron spin vector in a rotating magnetic field. And a little while later at Michigan, I attended an event by a guy named Jim Loudon. Jim worked at the museum doing planetarium shows, and he had something which he called the Astronomical Film Festival. Now, in those days, there was no YouTube or anything like that. In order to see movies or something like that, somebody had to go out and physically acquire a reel of film, get a projector, get a room, and he did that. He was a great presenter of astronomical situations. And he showed a film of JPL. And he also showed some films of Carl Sagan doing stuff. And I remember thinking to myself, JPL, that sounds like a cool place to work, but I don't have a degree in astronomy, so what use would they have for me? Anyway, Jim Loudon unfortunately died young, but he was a great presenter. He could have been another Carl Sagan and Neil deGrasse Tyson level person. But in about 1974, I left Michigan to go and start graduate school at Utah. And I left about a month early and kind of touristed the West Coast. And one of the places I stopped in was I went to Disneyland for the first time, and it was a magical experience. I was literally in tears. It was so wonderful. And then I went up to Pasadena and went to JPL. And I went up to the visitor center and said, hi, is there anything to see here, like exhibits or anything like that? And they said, well, no, if you don't know anybody here, then there's nothing you can see. So I looked through the gate and said, yep, wow, this is a real place. Cool. So then I went off to Utah and learned how to do leather donuts and stucco teapots. And, but, using the leather donut technology, I could also make, cratered moons. In 1977, when I finished at Utah, I'd heard that Ivan Sutherland had gone to the computer science department at Caltech. So I called him up and said, is there a place in your department for me? But to be honest with you, I'm probably going to go out and hang out at JPL and see if there's a project I can attach myself to somehow. And Ivan said, sure, that'd be great, but he happened to know somebody at JPL who already had an exact duplicate of the hardware we had at Utah and was looking for somebody to do something with it. And that somebody was, as Julian says, Bob Holtzman. Bob was a real interesting character, and it was kind of fun seeing him operate. And as Julian says, he protected us from the bureaucracy. And this is like a magical experience for me, suddenly being at this place. And also, it was not an officially sanctioned or requested situation. And so there's this delicate balance in working someplace of being, if you're doing something that's vital to the survival of the company, the management's always looking over your shoulder saying, when's it going to be done? When's it going to be done? Let me hire 5 more people to help you. And on the other side, if you're doing something that nobody cares about, you don't get any resources. And so there was this delicate balance that went on for the entire time I was there of getting resources but not having people pester us too much. So what I'm going to do is kind of go through the timeline of what happened during the 12 years that I was there. And we're going to zoom in and out of this, so if you can't read it, don't worry. Divided into 3 different phases, which are kind of correlated with the equipment we had. So phase 1 was, as I said, the PDP 1155, same thing we had at Utah, 128 kilobytes of memory, 2 megahertz clock, ENS frame buffer, which is 512 by 512 by 8-bit pixels, and a picture system 2. And this room that Bob had found was in building 264, which also happened to be the Voyager headquarters building, which is significant because we were on the first floor right inside the front door. Anybody coming to work would go by us and kind of look through the window and say, something happening here. And most of the Voyager people were up on the 6th floor. This is what the workstation looked like. There is basically a text display here, glass teletype, as they said. This is the picture system 2 with real-time line drawings, and this is the frame buffer, which had slower but color images. And there was a little button, knob box, you could twiddle knobs and so forth. And one of the first things that I did there was a movie of Venus. The Pioneer Venus orbiter was going around Venus with a radar altimeter on board, and measured through the clouds, cloud cover, you can't see anything, but through the clouds it would send back altitude data. Some people at MIT turned that actually into a map, and that's ideal suited for bump mapping. And also the color code is also the altitudes there. Then shortly after that, I met a guy named Charlie Kohlhaas, who was the chief mission planner of the Voyager project, and he and I collaborated a lot over the next few years. And he showed me a movie that he had made before I got there using a film recorder. He and a guy named Paul Penzo had several of these clips. This is just a few clips of it, of the mission plans that they had done. And so, bump mapped, texture mapped planets, line drawing things, and in the words of one of my favorite cartoon characters, Ferb, I know what we're going to do today. Well, it took us actually a year and a half, but the Voyager 1 Jupiter encounter was beginning of '79, and so I busied myself writing software to render color images of Voyager. These are some of the early, really rough drafts, just to show you it didn't happen overnight. The Voyager spacecraft looked like this, and we got a hold of some blueprints to create a digital model of that. We didn't actually use this digitizing thing very much. We used what is sometimes called the VI modeling system, although we didn't use VI as a text editor, but basically it involved typing in coordinates as text into the computer. And so we could get a polygonal model of the spacecraft that looked fairly decent. This is a picture of the user interface to the program, which was, it's all text. We didn't have mice in those days, at least on our computers. And basically you typed in numerical values for the various parameters, and then it would show you instantly a picture of that situation on the picture system line drawing. So the basic idea is that you would set up a few things. And Charlie Colhayes came down. Since he was the mission planner, he knew when things were happening. And so he came down and basically did the script of, at this time, we know this is going to happen, at this time, this is going to happen. And so he used the program to do that. The program was called Space. I like to give very generic names to my programs, planets, planets, and so forth. And so early on, I was at home, and he wanted to try something, and he called me up and said, how do I start up the program to try this out? And I said, okay, first type space and then return. I said, well, nothing happened. And finally we realized that, he was hitting the space bar. Anyway, in order to make color pictures, remember we only had a 8-bit per pixel frame buffer. This is the technology of slides at the time, drawing with a marker on paper and taking photographs of it. We had 8 bits per pixel, and it ran through what's called a color map, which each pixel was looked up in a 256 entry table, and then you could put a red, green, and blue value in there. And so you had to pick 256 colors out of the millions that you might want. So this is a color map that I used for the Voyager flyby movies. It basically was 32 steps of brightness by 8 steps of saturation. And unfortunately, Jupiter and the spacecraft were both basically orangish and whitish, so they fit into this. But still, 32 isn't quite enough, and so I had to use dithering in order to make the images look good. Apologies to Albie for making these little squares, but it's making a point here of what dithering looks like up close. Also, the shadow mask on the monitor similar to what they have today, but monitors in those days were not made for computers because they didn't have much computers. They were made for television. And so the dot pitch on the monitors was actually bigger than the pixel size. And so that's another source of noise in the image that came along. But then ultimately was able to put together a map of Jupiter using some of the early Voyager pictures from a couple of months out. Voyager actually had a telescope on board. And I'll describe the process of this in a little more detail in a minute. But cleaning that up a bit, here's the map of Jupiter and a few sample images of what Jupiter looked like. We hired an astronomical artist named Rick Sternbach to come in and paint us hypothetical maps of the various Galilean satellites because we had no idea what they looked like. They were just dots of light in the telescope. Also along this is this Io, and here's Callisto. Also, while we were doing this, Charlie kept coming downstairs and doing a series of still slides of events during the spacecraft mission that they were going to hand out to the press as well. Here's one for Ganymede. And so the production of the movie consisted of running the computer basically around the clock for 2-3 weeks, something like that, and each frame was written out on a magnetic tape. We didn't have a disc that was big enough to hold this, and so we filled up about 10 or 12 tapes. And then came the filming process, which was we got a instrumentation camera rigged up, and you had to kind of set up the camera in the room, aimed at the screen, figure out, perpendicular and get it centered properly, and then turn off all the lights in the room, load up the film, and then play in tape one. I wrote a program, read one tape, click the shutter, read a frame off the tape, click the shutter, do that. Took about 7 or 8 hours to record the whole movie, and the movie looked kind of like this. Now, I mentioned that we didn't have an official mandate to do this, and this is just kind of a project that I was doing with Charlie and a few other people. And so we took this film once it was finished, and we gave it to the Public Information Office, and they said, I don't know what to do with this, and they just kind of tossed it in a corner. Fortunately, Charlie had, in his job as being the head of mission planning, he had a meeting with the head administrator at NASA in Washington, D.C., about then, and he took a copy of the movie in to show him. And the NASA head says, this is great. We should make copies of this movie to give out as part of the press release to all the TV stations in the country. Great. And so they send us the negative and we'll make the copies. So we sent them the negative and they lost it. So I had to get out the camera and the tapes and refilm the whole thing and make a new negative. And this time we kept the negative and made copies ourselves. And so this is another amazing thing about the position I was in at JPL, being a publicly funded thing. They're really interested in showing off their work. So I had like an instant audience for this thing. A lot of people were doing computer graphics at the time and showing it as much as they could, but this showed up on the evening news throughout the entire country, and it was quite an amazing experience for me. Anyway, Voyager 1 took pictures of what the moons really looked like when they got there. Here's the 4 Galilean satellites, and it also discovered a very thin ring around Jupiter, and it discovered volcanoes on Io. And so Voyager 2 was going to go by Jupiter in about 3 months. And so this is the ideal, this is, Voyager 2, the sequel. And so we wanted to make a movie of Voyager 2, but now we had the real moons, and we had some other things to show off, not just to show what Voyager 2 was going to do, but show off the results kind of Voyager 1. So here's the process of reconstructing the maps. Here's a real picture from Voyager 1 of Io. This is my simulation of what position was at the time this was taken. This is zoomed in so you can now see the latitude and longitude. So our little program is like inverse texture mapping. It would scan through the texture, take each latitude and longitude, figure out where it came up on the thing, pick up that intensity and put it in the map. And so it re-stretched the thing out into a map projection. And by doing that with several pictures and a little bit of artistic interpolation between, we got a real map of what Io looked like. Similarly, I made a much better one of Jupiter at the time, and I figured out how to make a ring around Jupiter by just drawing a straight line across it, since it was a very thin ring. And here's the real map of Galileo. I think I can credit myself as being the first human being to see a complete map of Ganymede here. And this is Europa, and this is Callisto, which we only got some fuzzy pictures of, so a lot of this is artistic interpolation. So here's the Voyager 2 movie. Wait a second here, I'm clicking more than I needed to click. Let's move forward a little bit. So you can see what, these are all the things that, again, Charlie Colhay's choreographed the movie to correspond to what he had planned on doing in the real spacecraft. The spacecraft rotates every now and then to take magnetic measurements and so forth. There's the high-class ring simulation, and here's a close flyby of Ganymede. And Europa. And the little white flashes on Jupiter are not glitches. Those are actually simulated lightning flashes. That's another thing that they discovered in Voyager 1. Here's the volcanoes on Io. Somewhat cheesy approximation, but it's the actual scale, actually right side. And then the night side of Jupiter. So, since I had all the maps of the Galilean satellites, here's something interesting you can do with the information on the Galilean satellites. We're following along each satellite, kind of pointing in the same direction as it orbits Jupiter. And so you can get a sense of the sizes of them. And you can also see Jupiter in the background getting bigger and bigger as we get to more and more inner moons. The place where the moon flashes dark there is, again, not a glitch. That's the time when it's in eclipse behind Jupiter's behind our back now, blocking off the sun. So, something else interesting you can do is another film of what it would be like to actually sit on the surface of Io and watch Jupiter. All the Galilean satellites are in tidally locked orbits like our moon is, so they're always facing the same face towards Jupiter. So you stand someplace on one of the moons and Jupiter never moves in the sky. And so you can watch the day-night cycle go by and the other inner moon, smaller moons going around there. One of the things I want to mention about all these animations is that they're all geometrically correct. I did a simulation of the astronomy and where things are and what direction they're pointing in. The brightnesses, however, are adjusted for visibility because you might not see the stars. They might be too dim with respect to Jupiter, and all of the little moons there are really small, so they were just marked with little dots. And the next little event was Pioneer 11 was going by Saturn. That was not completely a JPL project, but it was something that we couldn't pass up. And so this is some early crude models of Saturn's rings. And we've got Rick Sternbach to do a map of what Titan might look like. And my brother, as it happens, came in and painted us a map of we use for Saturn. And so this is some of the pictures for that. And so here's the Pioneer 11 Saturn encounter. Pioneer 11 didn't really have a camera on board per se. It had a kind of a slit scan thing, so it was spinning continuously, stroking out the images as they came back. But it had a very dramatic view underneath the rings of Saturn. This is a very crude approximation to the ring lighting based on some Earth-based photographs of the brightness of the rings from the inner edge to the outer edge. And one of the nice things about this is that all these things could keep improving the model as more and more data kept coming in. The other nice thing about resurrecting all these movies is the credit sequence reminds me of the names of all the people who worked on them. So the next thing was Cosmos. Well, it turns out that one of Charlie Culhay's good friends was another engineer at JPL named Gentry Lee, who happened to be Carl Sagan's business partner in doing the Cosmos series. So he hooked us up with Carl Sagan and KCT and so forth, and so we got a contract to do some animation for Cosmos. And also about this time, Albert Ray Smith came and joined us, as well as David Francisco, after they had left New York Tech. And they worked with us for a while on Cosmos and some other projects. And also Pat Cole came out about that time and also worked on Cosmos. JPL is mostly publicly funded, but the stuff for Cosmos was actually copyrighted. Most of JPL stuff is public domain. So we got permission from Carl Sagan's widow to show a few clips from Cosmos. A lot of what we did was actually just diagrammatic things, but these are all mathematically based. This is the Kepler's 3 laws. Planets travel in ellipses with the sun at the focus, sweep out equal areas in equal times, and the farther away from the sun you are, the slower they move, basically. Here's a thing that Charlie did with a high long period comet gets slowed down by interacting with Jupiter, turning into a short period comet. Here's evolution of a constellation over time as proper motion. This is like what the constellation looks like in 3D because they're all at different distances from the Earth. Here's one that Charlie did shows the accretion of dust into planetaries to make planets. Each one of these things basically is a separate Fortran program. They're all mathematically based, but we didn't have a general purpose animation program at the time. This is a scene about the Big Bang, sort of metaphorically. This is a scene that Albie worked on, and this is actually from the blooper reel. We had the camera in the room, clicking the shutter off with the door locked and taking the pictures. And the janitor came in and opened the door and started cleaning out the room. So we had to start over again with that. The next two big scenes that we did were the human evolution scene. This one was animated mostly by Pat Cole. We got a series of like 40 or 50 drawings from the Cosmos people of key events during the evolutionary sequence, and I wrote this little animation interpolation program, and then Pat digitized all of the characters in there and matched up the lines to which line matches up to who, and got several different branches in the evolutionary scale that went off to do things other than humans, and ultimately we wound up with human beings. And Pat also did this, just a little metaphorical thing showing the Voyager evolving into one of the ships of exploration as a metaphor between the discoveries and so forth. And it turns out that the evolution sequence, when they had the reboot of the Cosmos a few years ago with Neil deGrasse Tyson, the evolution sequence was the one scene that they actually showed intact from the original thing. And so I called up Pat to say, hey, did you see this? And her son answered the phone and said, I'm sorry to tell you that Pat passed away a couple months ago. So rest in peace, Pat. She was a good friend and a good colleague. But keep in touch with your friends because they might not be there when you try to get them next. Well, next thing was, as we were kind of winding down Cosmos, they came to me with this drawing and said, we need to somehow or other do a thing about how DNA replicates. Can you do an animation of something like this? And I said, no. We had a PDP-11 with 128K of memory, only 64K was addressable at any one time. I went home thinking, yeah, in order to do this, you'd have to have like an electron density centered at each atom, and you run an isodensity surface through that, and then if you had a scanline algorithm that would explode these things, and I might actually be able to pull this off. And so that's what I came up with. And in order to do this, I had to get some data, and it turned out that earlier on, we had the software. Yeah. You touch these things and they click. Let's see. Oh, no, back. Yeah, okay. I mentioned that the software situation that came with the ENS frame buffer was just basically a Fortran compiler and a text editor, and that's it. ENS didn't have any software, and so I was able to install some of the stuff that I had. And it turned out the National Institute of Health had another similar system that didn't have anything on it as well. And so ENS flew me out to DC to install our software on that and get them up and running. And that was run by a guy named Tom Porter. And Tom Porter happened to have a database of what DNA looked like. And so he gave me the basic geometry of DNA. And I had originally had fantasies of simulating it by just doing an actual simulation of things, but that turned out to be crazy, so I actually animated it manually. And this is what we came up with. Let me tell you, this was hard. There's 4,000 atoms in here. Cramming that into a 64 kilobyte memory required some tricks. And also, each of these frames took 10 minutes to half an hour to calculate sometimes. And so I was running around campus, borrowing time on all the other PDP-11s to have them do a few of the frames. This is a enzyme that splits it apart. Fortunately, we did not know what that enzyme really looked like. And so I came up with this simple model of it. It was, if we had the real complex enzyme in there, that would have been too much to handle. Here's another enzyme that plugs the thing together. So we had enough computer time to do every fourth frame of the animation. And so we did every fourth frame, and then we recorded it. And we showed it to the Cosmos people, and they said, this is great. If we give you more time, can you do every other frame? And so Bob, bless his heart, found out somebody else on lab who had this new gadget called a VAX, which was much faster than the PDP-11. And so we got some time on the VAX to calculate the interstitial frames. So, and then we had this big merge operation between the frames that we had and the new ones and interspersing them. And so we got the final thing, as you're seeing, is every other frame. There was one spot actually where I was refilming it, and you see, the picture comes on, click shutter, picture comes, click shutter, and the picture came on, it was all wrong. So I hit the interrupt button just before it clicked the shutter. I had to go through and figure out what was wrong with the program, rerun it for the 20 bad frames, generate the new bad frames, stick those in the pipeline, resume the filming, and so I was able to do it without screwing up the movie. Film is a real pain in the butt, and I'm glad I got rid of it ultimately. So that was the Cosmos project. Five what? Minutes?
5 minutes left.
Oh, okay. So Cosmos and all this stuff was very busy, and so I was basically fried at this point and tired of trying to use a PDP-11, and so I called up Ed Capel to say, do you have a place in your organization for me to come and visit and work? And he said yes. And so I was going to leave JPL, and at that time, Bruce Murray, the director of JPL, came to me and said, hey, Jim, we don't want to lose you. If we buy you a VAX and a full-color frame buffer, will you stay? And I said, well, yeah, but I kind of promised Ed that I'd come up there, so I wound up kind of doing half-time for the first half of 1981. Meanwhile, I was doing the Voyager 2 flyby movie with some better maps. This is Don Davis painted the maps, and a better mathematical model of the rings, showing the lighting differences from the sunlit and non-sunlit side. So here's the Voyager 1 movie, and this is obviously a little nod to the Flash Gordon movie serials of the 1940s. Actually, it was Star Wars, but that was a nod to the movie serials in the 1940s. So anyway, here we are going through Saturn and under the rings and so forth. And again, we didn't know what the moons really looked like, so we had the fake maps. Also, he drew some Uranus, Neptune, and Triton maps, and so we did a little previews of coming attractions that we handed out at the thing of what expected to happen over the next couple of years. And did Saturn's magnetic field. I'll skip over that one. Here's a picture of us giving a demonstration during the Voyager encounter to Jerry Brown, who was governor of California, and I understand still is. I'm going to spend a minute or two talking about, we had a lot of visitors to the lab, and from the various industries. Since we were located near Hollywood, a lot of people came in, and this was our first introduction to some of my favorites were Gene Roddenberry and George Pal, but my favorite guy was mental blank. The animator, one of the Disney, Ward Kimball, yes. And I don't have time to tell you the story about that, but maybe later. So here's the real pictures that came back from Jupiter, or from Saturn. And it turned out that after a while at Lucasfilm, doing halftime there, I taught a course with Ed Catmull that Richard Chang recorded, and he's since put up on YouTube, so you can search for CG Time Machine and see that. 40 minutes in, there's actually a live demo film within a film of the stuff. So finally, I returned to JPL full-time to do the Voyager 2 Saturn movie with Mimas, and did started out with, on the surface of Mimas, got a polygonal model of Mimas, showing some of the results of the Voyager 1, and going through Saturn. We did some star occultations and so forth. And that's the Voyager 2 Saturn movie. And I'll skip that one. Then there's phase 2, where we got this VAX and a real frame buffer. This is the place where we had it in the new building. Notice we had the picture system through a window in the room because that thing was noisy. We hated living in the same room with it, and so we watched it through a window. This is Sue Kovac, an engineer I worked with some spacecraft design issues. We did a quickie thing for Galileo before the fact to help get funding for Galileo, and you can kind of see the thing, you know, flybys of the various moons. And finally got around to writing up the math for this thing, for the lobby things, and so I did this animation with a dancer named Ariel Thomas to show that off. And here's another thing that Charlie put together using the new database from the star occultation with 20,000 data points from the inner edge to the outer edge of the rings. And I'll skip a couple of these things. The final thing that we did was the mechanical universe, which was the program that I was kind of designed for. David Goodstein, the physics professor at Caltech, got a grant to do a college-level physics course, and we moved to an off-site location in Pasadena, and we got the thing to generate NTSC video. And Richard Chang also helped us out with that by telling us how to get the videos to Genlock. Otherwise, we would never be able to do it. And we got a Sony BVH 2500 1-inch Type-C videotape machine, which became my best friend for the next 6 years. And a student named Tom Brown came in and painted some extra maps to use, for example, for the opening title sequence, which, startling enough, had a lot of flybys of planets in it. Sylvie came on board about that time and helped me out doing the mechanical universe. And over the next several years, we generated about 7 hours worth of animation for it. And this is my favorite project, which I don't have a lot of time to show you, but fortunately, it's all up on YouTube. And if you look at youtube.com/Caltech or jimblinn.com, there'll be links to various samples from the mechanical universe. And this is all of the videotapes that we filled up with animations. And then finally, after that, running out of time here. We did a pilot episode for Project Mathematics, and Sylvie designed this great opening sequence for that. Oh, there we go. Anyway, so, and about this time, once we finished the pilot, I found out that I wasn't working for Bob Holtzman anymore, as a testament to the obliviousness I had of what was going on. I didn't even realize that somebody else was now the director of the lab, and Bob Holtzman had left to do other things about 6 months earlier. And so things were starting to get a little weird there, and so as a result, I wound up moving myself over to Caltech campus, replicating the whole thing on PC clones, because without Bob Holtzman being in charge, it really wasn't that much fun anymore. Thank you.
So I got to JPL at the same time, just about the same time as Jim did. And, you know, this is a history talk, so we're going over things about how we all got there, and obligatory history talks we'll start with. In July 1976, I opened up the San Francisco Chronicle one morning, and there was this big 2-page spread with a picture like this, and Viking had just gotten to Mars. And I looked at this thing and I said, I got to do that. So next spring, when they had exiting senior interviews, then I went and talked to JPL. They invited me down for interviews. I did 11 interviews at JPL that one day, and that's how I ended up at the graphics lab. The things I'm going to talk about are some of the other stuff that happened at JPL, because it's a working research center, and so there are things, many things there that never hit the public eye, and those are most of the things that I worked on. I stayed there at the lab for a few years until going to graduate school. I didn't know what I was getting into, because when I came out of Berkeley, it was like, oh boy, I get to do space. And I didn't know I was ending up in the lab, which was being run by my mentors, Jim Blinn and Bob Holzman, and this led to the opportunity of studying with my other mentor, Frank Crow, so it was quite an opportunity. Now, nonetheless, some of the projects that I worked on, so the first deliverable out of the lab was actually a visualizer for Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. On the PS2, you could twist the knobs and move the airplane around and do cross-sectioning, and we sent that to them in February of '78, and they were quite happy with it. Then later worked on this program, which did Deep Space Network tracking visualization. It's a spacecraft out somewhere, and the DSN has 3 tracking stations, and so that you could rotate the Earth and then it'd see which tracking stations had good sighting of the spacecraft. Another one was Voyager telemetry visualization, because data comes back from Voyager and an engineer needs to look at data, and this might be, it specifies some time range, and here's the difference, is that the time might be an Earth time or a spacecraft time. Because of the lag, they're different, and because the lag is increasing all the time, it gets even wackier. Anyway, the engineer would specify time and channels and send the request over to the Voyager IT Center, who would construct a mag tape and then send it back to us, and we'd load it in, and then I'd put it on the picture system. The engineer could scroll around through the data. This program was used to find a short circuit in Voyager 2. Now, of these applications here, before they existed, the only way to visualize stuff going on in missions was printouts. Or JPL had a comm device, but using that was very complex, required a lot of engineer time, and of course was batch processing because it's microfiche, so it wasn't really interactive in the least. So being the junior engineer, some of the other things I got to work on were internal. Like if you come from a Unix background, forking is no problem, right? On RSX, it's completely hidden from the developer. So I found out from UCSD how to do forking and then was able to write programs, because one of the things I really missed from Unix was make, so I wrote our own PDA. Got to experiment with learning animation. Because there were 8-bit planes in the ENS frame buffer, could do 8 animations, an 8-cell flipbook, and then David made a couple animations with that. And then, of course, paint programs. Remember this point about limited address space. We couldn't put everything in one paint program, so we had to have different versions running around. And going back to that Viking image, I was delighted to find out one day that we were just down the hall from the Viking data center, and I had access to their data, and we had all these paint programs running around, so I was able to put life on Mars. Did you see this? You came in here not knowing you were going to get that question settled, right? The Pioneer 11 movie was the first one that I got to have a significant role on, and that required, it's a lot of work making a movie. I think some people remember that. So Jim showed the movie. There's a nice shot of Titan and Saturn. What didn't make it out in the press was that on the back of Titan, Rick Sternbach painted the texture map, and then after he left, I modified it. On the back, it says "Eat at Joe's." This is a running gag between me and Bob, but I made very sure this did not show up during the movie. This is an example, by the way, of fun squared, at least if you're a techie. Because working at JPL is fun itself. That's just a given. But then to start doing things like playing with the texture maps, that's fun squared. I did another movie about a proposed mission to go to Comet Halley and then on to Comet Tempel 2. And Halley came back in '86, as you remember, and then Tempel 2 is a short period comment. The idea was a spacecraft would circle it for a year, making observations, and then crash into the nucleus. This movie was abused by NASA to try and get funding for the mission, and the US did not go to Comet Halley in '86. Pretty much everybody else did. The spacecraft was going to be powered by ion drive. If you ever get to see an ion drive working, it's creepingly interestingly. We did another movie about the Pioneer Venus mission. This was more of a documentary. An odd note about this movie is that we led it off with this painting, which you'll recognize as being one of the classics of art history, and headquarters sent it back objecting to the nudity. And then another movie trying to get, working on funding for other Comet missions. So of these 4 movies here, only one of them actually made it out in the public eye. The rest were all used by NASA for internal purposes. So there are many missions proposed. Only a few get funded and executed. Back to the internal tools, I wrote this text editor, limited address space again. So the application loaded the file into the ENS frame buffer and used the picture system to visualize it. And you could then use the picture system controls to move through the file and the stylus to select text and edit. So a very early copy and paste. Bob pointed out it was the world's most expensive text editor, which it was, since you need an ENS picture system and an ENS frame buffer. This was later extended to the Fortran structuring aid, because structured Fortran was all the rage in the 70s. JPL had its own version called SFTran. The one on Unix was RAT4. And this, it read in the code, and the programmer could specify blocks and indentation all visually on the PS2, and then it would write out the SFTran for its regular processing afterwards. This turned into my first paper at SIGGRAPH, Software Engineering Conference, which was conveniently scheduled the 3 days before Oktoberfest. NBC News was going to do a series called Escape Velocity, 12 one-hour episodes of NASA's technology spin-offs. They produced the first episode, and then NBC didn't do it. We couldn't look at full-color frame buffers back then, so one day I took 3 AEDs, chained them together, put the video out onto one monitor, and that gave us 24-bit pixels. Modified the paint program so they knew how to split the pixels apart. The Pioneer Venus mission, we had all this side-looking radar data, and you saw the texture map in Venus spinning around. But then I triangulated the data so we could construct a 3D model, and then ran that in through the renderer. So we were able to do 3D modeling of the surface of Venus from that SLR data. The vertical range is greatly extended here. And this is the Great Rift Canyon on Venus, the Great Circular Canal, and Maxwell Montes. To give you an idea of the size here, that plateau between the two peaks is the size of the continental US. So this was the first time that the surface of Venus had ever been seen. It was using these 3D models constructed from the PVO, the Pioneer Venus orbiter data. Modified that to work with side-looking sonar data, which I think came out of NOAA, to look at the seafloor of Monterey Bay. So the same principles, just the data was going down instead of up. Right? And ignore that one in the back, that was a bug. But anyway, this is the seafloor of Monterey, and over in the, just about in the middle of the back wall, you can see where the Great Rift Canyon of Monterey Bay, where the Pajaro River comes into, and it's not real apparent, just you see a depression there. But again, this is the first time that anybody had ever seen the seafloor. Using bathymetry data, we're able to construct a bump map and run it through Jim's bump map renderer and look at the Earth without water. So this is all about 1980. And at some point, Bob or David, or maybe the two of them colluding together, came up with the idea of the online frame buffer art shows. And the idea was to show the imagery in the environment that the creator used to create it. So at SIGGRAPH 81, there were a bunch of monitors set up and a PDP-11 cycling through them with a bunch of AEDs that were loaned by AED, and just showing imagery donated or provided by Jim and David and NYIT and I think Robert Abel. And it was really exhausting. I think I got this show working 5 minutes before it opened after 23-hour days. The AED user group asked me to give a presentation on constructing this show, and I was so tired, I didn't know that until then it was possible to fall asleep standing up. The shows continued in 82 and 83, and then they went away for a while. A couple of comments about the working environment there. I'm going to make specifically about filming. I wanted you to note the technology in the lower right, which was, we're doing the state-of-the-art graphics, and that was a state-of-the-art telephone at the time. These were how we interacted. Eventually, we first started with printing terminals and got CRTs. I used to use 3 at a time because I'd get one busy and then just go on to the next one. The filming process, early on, we didn't have any kind of equipment, so it consisted of hitting carriage return, loading the frame, pressing the shutter release button, repeating all night long. And you had to do it perfectly. Eventually, Photolab gave us an intervalometer which would click the camera at preset intervals, and that was time to load the frame. And then, so I would hear the intervalometer click, hit return, and then load the next frame. You know, at 3 in the morning, you have to do this sequence perfectly, and after 6 or 7 hours of it, you get in this phase error of, did I hit CR or not? And he wondered, did I hit CR or not? And the only way you find out is 2 days later when you get the processed film back from the lab. And if it didn't go right, you redo the whole process. So at some point, I took one of the styluses, wired it to the intervalometer so that when it clicked the camera, the picture system would think that the stylus had been pressed down. So after complaining and complaining lots and lots, Jim got Bob to build a real exposure device, and that's what Jim was using to make the movies. Another sociological note, remember the PDP-11 front panel lights? Well, some of you can. I wrote a program which would download an arbitrary animated pattern of lights. And what I thought was interesting was that so many people were coming in to look at Jim's stuff, all this state-of-the-art graphics, but they'd still stand there for a couple of minutes looking at the blinky lights on the computer. And then finally, one of our functions as a public research center was outreach. There were lots of demos, just lots and lots of demos, and many requests for demos. I convinced Bob to get an answering machine, which in the late 70s was newfangled technology, right? And I recorded on it, "You've reached the JPL Computer Graphics Laboratory. Everyone has turned into a vegetable. Please leave a message." Sometimes the message would be somebody laughing and hanging up. One particular example of outreach that I thought was important was for the Los Angeles School District. They got to 200 students to tour JPL, get exposure to different kinds of science. And of course, our lab was on that list. And I got to do demos to 200 junior high school students, and junior high students have a lot of energy. And then we also worked with another artist named Paul Allen Newell, who was doing a motion study on one of Escher's drawings. Let's see. In '81, I went back to graduate school full time, and then only returned to the graphics lab as a visitor. And I'd like to transition to David.
All right, well, let's change the channel for a minute and go in a different direction. Can everyone hear me? We're good? Okay. First, I just want to thank Julian for getting the band back together again. It's the first time we've seen each other, and we've been in constant contact over the last 3 or 4 weeks, trading stories and memories, and turns out we all have completely different ideas of what happened at different points in time. So that's been a lot of fun. I've got a controller here. Let's see if it works. And so far, so good. So when I saw the SIGGRAPH brochure about this, I looked at our names, and it said that Jim was retired. I don't know if that's true or not. He's retired. Said I'm retired, but unfortunately, artists don't get to retire. So I'm still fully active, still doing what I do, and I just wanted to start off and have a little reflection on where we were with the JPL lab and where we are today, because you've gotten a pretty graphic description, I think, of some of the stuff that you've been exposed to. I don't see a picture coming up here. Looks like we're
Switched.
That's us.
Advance the slide.
There we go. And so now, you know, from all of those rooms of hardware and software and the trauma, and, you know, I'm producing work on my phone now. It's really a very different place to be. And it's a very different kind of experience. And so I just want to see that we've come to a really different place, but we couldn't have gotten here without all of the work from the people that you've heard of today. So I want to talk a little bit about what the experience of being an artist in a high-tech lab was like, because in a sense, these high-tech labs will never exist again in the same way. And I'll start with my own origin story, which was that I met Bob Holtzman, who we keep coming back to. And Bob was an incredible person. I went cross-country in 1975 because I'd figured out that digital visualization was where art was going to go. And I met a lot of people. I met Fred Park at Case Western Reserve. He said, "Why don't you look at what JPL is doing?" And I called JPL, and through a long sequence of events, I was able to get together with Bob, and Bob said, well, we don't really have anything going, but I'm trying to get funding for a lab, and it actually would be cool to have an artist here. And that's essentially how I wound up at JPL, because in the following year, they did get funding, and I moved to LA, and a year and a half later, the lab actually got up and running. There was a real culture at the lab because Bob himself didn't have he wasn't high enough in the pecking order to really get me into the lab. He went to his boss, and his boss, Dave Rose, worked for several months, and he went to his boss, Mike Plessett, and it took about a year before officially Bob's vision of, hey, it would be cool to have an artist actually turned into something. There were other earlier artists that I've heard about that were involved with NASA, and I don't know if that's true or not, but I was there from 76 to 88. We went through some pretty radical changes. This was what the lab looked like at the time. There's the artist in the lab. But really, what it was like was this. This is what I remember the lab being. It was dark and it was cold. And we even had a sartorial manifestation. I remember having my pant legs pushed into my socks to keep warm. I had a pair of alpaca gloves with the fingers cut out so that I could work on the keyboard. And everyone looked pretty peculiar in that place. This is what the PDP looked like and so forth. And the only reason I'm showing this is to try to understand that in 1975, 1976, an artist studio did not look like this. You know, an artist studio tried to bring in light was the idea. Bring in the sun, bring in the photons. And suddenly everything was fluorescent light, indoors, looking at screens. And it was a certain kind of adjustment that most artists in the art world were not able to even relate to at that point. I've often wondered what it was about it that made it comfortable to me, and I think it had something to do with the fact that I read a lot of comic books when I was a kid, and all the superheroes were actually scientists, and they all had like Batman had the Batcave, and the Flash had like his own little secret science lab, and so it was kind of cool, this idea of being in a lab. I liked it. The other thing that was a big change was going from, brushes, sculpture tools, and things like that to numbers. Suddenly, everything was about numbers, and it changed the way I looked at images, the way I looked at form, the way I looked at composing and conceiving of everything. And in the end, it wound up with this, a bunch of bits. And so that was a real mental transition for me to think of physical objects as a bunch of bits that were magnetically encoded on a piece of tape or on a disk. And those were transitional steps that I had to go through to get to a place where everything really made sense. Let's see. So I'll show a few pictures. When I started there, this was like 1978 at this point, I started working with very simple forms, a lot of them courtesy of Jim, and then I started doing things to them, and accidents would happen. And so that was kind of a problem, but I liked the accidents. I thought it was cool. I came from a background of Marcel Duchamp and John Cage, and so when weird things would happen, such as, I don't know if you can see the center of this image here, that's not what the grid is supposed to be doing. The grid is supposed to be perfect. And I thought that was just really great. I liked that. This was another one that it was one of the first pieces that I felt was a successful work of art, and it was a sphere. It got too close to the clipping plane, and so half of it fell apart, and now we're looking at the inside and the outside simultaneously. And I remember walking into the room, because these things would take like a while to render, so I'd go out, have a cup of coffee, walk around, and just going, wow, look at that. That's amazing. So I loved being in that space where you didn't exactly know what would happen. This was an image that still has legs. I still get requests for this. It's very simple, but if you look at the right side of the sphere, you see how it's fallen apart. You see the rastering problems. It was part of what made the thing work. People like that. And because it's not real, but it's real, it's perfect, but it's not perfect, and your head tries to put those things together and you have a certain kind of experience. And I found out that I was very good at breaking programs, and I think that was maybe the biggest contribution I ever made to the lab, was I would figure out how to do things that would make everything come tumbling down, and then Jim would have to figure out how to make them come back up again. So I don't have a lot of time, so this is kind of the Cliff's Notes version of a lot of what went on at the lab. We've heard all about the flybys. We know about them. It was an exciting period. You know, the media would come from all over the planet to be there. But also, as the spacecraft was getting closer to the planet, pictures were coming back, and we would see those pictures. And I was immersed, I was fascinated by this stuff. You know, and human eyes had never seen these pictures before. And so even before the films were made and released to the public, things were coming back, and I found that it influenced my thinking a lot. And so a whole series of ideas about creating my own worlds really came from the fact that it was JPL, it was that graphics lab, which was this very unique environment. And so a lot of people associate these pictures with science fiction, and I got to meet a lot of great science fiction writers at JPL, but really it was all pure science fact that was going on. This is an image called Transjovian Pipeline. I'm going to stop for just a second to talk about that, because pipeline is to me as Keep on Truckin' is to Robert Crumb. You know, whatever I do for the rest of my life, I'm going to be associated with this picture. And it is because for some reason, I didn't know it at the time. When I did it, I was literally working in complete obscurity. It connected in a way that said something at a time when you've got to remember that in the 70s, computers were still seen by most of the world as evil and scary. And the art world absolutely saw it that way. And when pictures like this and the Voyager flybys were released, people like started scratching their heads and going, wow, that's kind of cool, that's interesting. And the technology became a good guy story instead of it's going to come and it's going to kill all your children and eat them alive and boil them in oil. And that was a sense of what things were like. And so I think these images, the Voyager flybys and Pipeline in particular, which has been reproduced, it's one of the most reproduced art images of the 1980s, affected people internationally in a way that they changed their thinking about the technology that we all now just take completely for granted. I'm sure I'm running out of time. What have I got?
6 minutes.
6 minutes? Oh, okay, I'll slow down. Let me go into slow-mo. Good, excellent, great. Other changes that happened as a result of this was my approach conceptually to what the art experience can be. When I started, I was coming more from the idea that you compose for a frame, you make an object. There are traditional ways of doing things. In the Renaissance, there was this idea that you were trying to create art as if you were looking through a pane of glass. And then in the 40s and the 50s, there was this other idea that you wanted to make art like you were like looking through a car windshield that was speeding at breakneck rate. And then this turned it into something else, because now you could actually go through the looking glass. You actually could start to create things that instead of composing, because Pipeline was a transitional picture in that way, I was still kind of thinking of composing like there's that theatrical fourth wall and you're breaking the wall, and so I was kind of like looking around inside the space. But then somewhere between 1979 and early 1980, I realized that you could create worlds that you could completely immerse yourself in. And this created a whole different approach as to what it was that I was doing, because instead of now composing for a frame, I was inside of a space and I could approach things from more the way a photographer looks at things or a cinematographer looks at things as, oh, look what's over here. So I would build the world and then go into the world and then start looking around to see what might be going on there that was unexpected. Just like the accidents happened in the very first phases, there were these surprises that kind of kept the whole thing alive. then other thing that happened was that the technology was changing. Jim and Julian talked a little bit about, frame buffers and all that. There's so much we take for granted now that it's just hard to believe what it was like to try to compose a color picture with 8 bits. You really had to think and calculate and jigger and shoehorn and get everything to work so that it was even remotely believable. But when we got a 24-bit frame buffer, all of that changed because now we had access to full color. We're losing our picture again here. There we go. Look at that one again. So this was suddenly the whole realm of the senses, in a sense, was there. And the ability to create continuous tone changed everything. I'd gotten pretty blown out after making a couple of films at JPL and thought I never want to look at a screen again for the rest of my life. But when we got the full color frame buffer going, that was just a revelation to have that as a tool. And so that led to a whole new series of images that were working on levels that simply hadn't been possible before. And so that changed my approach to things pretty radically. And then during the final period, this is now into the 80s, I started to realize that the numbers really were the core of the thing. And by changing numbers in small ways, I could affect big changes in form and the way that form was manifest and the way that form could evolve. And so I started working, changing the objects, changing the textures, and it was really a pretty painful experience. This was really pushing the system to its absolute limits. These frames were taking an hour to generate without any aliasing going on. And so we finally got to the point of the last stage of the lab. And this is actually the last picture that I made at JPL. It was a very strange period because Bob was gone, and then Jim was at Caltech, and suddenly there was like nobody there. But the lab was still running. It was like being on this ghost spaceship. And so I would come in, there was nobody really running anything as it sort of transitioned off into the military, which as Sylvie might talk about that a little bit in a minute. And so the place finally went into this final stage. And so I was trying to make these pictures that evolved over time in a space that evolved over time. And it was just more than the system had ever been designed to do. So everything crashed, and all my memories are of nothing but trauma. And so these pictures were on disk for over a quarter of a century because I just didn't even want to think about them again. And then I recently reconstructed them and realized that, hey, a couple of these aren't actually half bad. So there's been a little archaeological process of bringing these things back to a new life. So I'll wind up, and everything, looking back, everything really has changed in ways that you just can't explain to people what trying to produce something with kilobytes of memory was, to actually make a picture with that. What did you have to go through? What was the process? But I think what the lab really did was it changed the awareness around the world more than any other institution that this is something that really takes us to new places that physically we've never been, and psychologically we've never been, and conceptually we've never been. And it was really a privilege to work with these guys there over that period of time. And with that, I'll wind up.
Sylvie Roof unfortunately had to cancel attending SIGGRAPH, so she made a video for her part of the presentation.
Hello, I'm Sylvie Roof, member of technical
Audio
staff
from this?
of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory's Computer Graphics Lab. I'm Sylvie Roop, a member of technical staff in the Jet Propulsion Laboratory's computer graphics.
Oh, shoot. I don't know how to do a touch bar.
In February of 1983, with my freshly minted degree in computer
It's got
science
that touch bar thing.
and animation. My first job was converting software from an IBM to a VAX in the Image Processing Lab, IPL. That year at SIGGRAPH, I met Bob Holzman, the founder. Hello, I'm Sylvie Roop, a member of technical staff in the Jet Propulsion Laboratory's Computer Graphics Lab from June 1984 to September 1990. I arrived at JPL in February of 1983 with my freshly minted degree in computer science and a minor in animation. My first job was converting software from an IBM to a VAX in the Image Processing Lab, IPL. That year at SIGGRAPH, I met Bob Holzman, the founder of the Computer Graphics Lab, who offered me a job. I infamously turned him down, saying, "I'm just a novice." During the next year, I learned what I did and didn't know, and when he made the offer again, I took it. The CGL group included gifted system and hardware people, along with computer graphics people. At JPL, we were sometimes known as the Dirty Dozen, which included Bob. I arrived after the mechanical universe was approved, when the challenges of production were clear. It was a terrific opportunity to work on a quality educational endeavor sponsored by the Annenberg CPB project. My job was to do whatever Jim Blinn couldn't or didn't want to do, including, but not limited to, computing and recording videos, more than 8 hours in those years, producing thousands of stills to illustrate the mechanical universe books for talks, proposals, publications, and the archives, which meant constant gamma correction for the Dunn camera's drifting color signal. I wrote up proposals and reports with the associated accounting, papers, storyboards, and presentations, and served as a receptionist for Jim, since, like many men, he was allergic to the phone. As some members of our group did not relate well with each other, I also interceded in communications. As time went on, I learned to use the system, built models, and designed and produced animation on my own. The deadlines for the mechanical universe were demanding, and the animations became a bigger part of every episode as time went on. Ultimately, the series was broadcast in 48 states and Japan and garnered more than 23 national and international awards. When I arrived at the CGL, I had not gotten a raise in over a year. Bob told me I would be paid overtime, but I didn't have to actually work it. In reality, my work weeks were generally 60 to 80 hours. Bob Holzman was a genius and a visionary. He was adept at the politics of JPL and NASA, saying he knew where the bodies were buried. He knew how to get the most out of really bright people, and he was a joy to work for. As a mentor, he invited me in on the negotiations of grants, contracts, and acquisitions. His negotiating style was to offer a reasonable deal, if not generous, for the other party. If they refused his initial offer and came back with less, he would counter by doubling his original price, making it closer to the true cost. As part of our work, we studied filmmaking, animation, science, art, math, education, and so much more. Bob supported all the research we thought would benefit us, including taking movie breaks and frequenting bookstores and museums. The NASA work was our constant thread, though. Trips to NASA headquarters with Bob always included great food, trips to the Smithsonian, art, and theater. Yes, he signed our per diem, but the difference was out of his own pocket. In March of 1986, the Japanese, the European Space Agency, and the Soviets went to Halley's Comet, and we made the movie. In 1985, NASA headquarters and the BBC wanted a video. Our challenges were to model the 5 spacecraft, use scientist theories for comet activity, and fly the encounters with our space simulation system. We had 3 smuggled photographs of 2 turquoise Soviet Vega spacecraft, each showing different instruments taken during assembly, obviously surreptitiously from about hip height. Second, the 3 scientist models didn't work visually. Each had stills of their comet models, but they didn't fly in 3D, and the 3 theories did not work together. That frustrating experience informed our future dream and plans, demonstrating the need for generic graphics workstations where scientists could sit down together with pictures as a common language. So, we used a painted comet, and our Vega spacecraft were a lovely turquoise. Our faces were red when, during encounter, the Soviets published pictures of their white, flask-shaped Vegas. Those animation frames were too heavy to recompute, so we re-recorded the Vega segments using gamma tweaking to bleach out the blue. Unfortunately, it's only the first edition of the movie that survives. We were working hard on the mechanical universe, delivering 5 minutes of animation every 2 weeks, when our true Mission Impossible came in November of 1985. We had been preparing for Voyager Uranus encounter, updating space by integrating trajectories, instrument aiming, and orbital element data, enhancing our spacecraft and updating our Uranus. We were on time to deliver 8+ minutes of simulation animation on January the 10th, which was 2 weeks before closest encounter on January 24th, 1986. On November 18th, NASA headquarters was in a panic. The earliest pictures coming back from Uranus showed a planet with no visible features. They wanted our animation by December the 2nd, and we wouldn't be emailing it to them. It took 5 days with mission planners to get camera angles, and then all we had to do was produce about 8,550 frames and lay them down. Frames for space animations took 30 seconds to 30 minutes each to compute. Our disk drive held 256 megabytes. The frames were run length encoded, but were from 1/4 megabyte to 1 megabyte per frame, which necessitated harvesting batches of about 10 seconds of animation at a time to the BVH 2500 1-inch video tape recorder. A Faruja time-based corrector and video waveform monitor assured we were producing broadcast quality video. Each batch recorded had to be closely inspected for frames with black dropout pixels, resulting from goo on the videotape, imperfections in the magnetic recording material. When found, these frames were scrubbed by re-recording the frames several times. When we backed up the batch of frames to the computer tape, and then we erased each recorded frame from the disk drive and restarted computing more frames. Jim had created virtual frame buffers, so we weren't held captive by having a single de Anza raster display processor, used as both computing memory and to convert digital to analog signals. Our 6 big multi-sync monitors around the lab were used to design frames, monitor frame production, playback animation, and monitor the done camera. The cheap old TV was our double check for design readability, even in black and white. We ran up to 8 processes at a time, 1 process on each of the terminals in our lab and our offices. Our Evans and Sutherland PS2 vector display processor was used to plan animation. We had serial number 2. The Navy had serial number 1. With 2 3/4-inch U-matic and a VHS recorder, we edited and made dubs of our work. In all, the lab's equipment cost more than $360K, close to $1 million in today's money. Planning 3 minutes per frame to compute and 7 seconds for recording makes 442 hours minimum in compute time, plus work on the human housekeeping to keep it going. We had 10 days to get it done and get it to Washington. There were 2 VAX 11-780s and an 8600 attached to a secret military project in our building, which we were never part of. Neither of us ever wanted a security clearance. For only this project, the Uranus project, we used those machines in background, at night, and when their personnel were on vacation. And we pushed our own 11-780 nonstop. I worked for 120 hours over the next week, leaving just enough time for a few showers and naps, and to go out to eat between the care packages Glenn Garneau my main squeeze delivered. We got it finished. On Christmas Eve, Glenn and I made a trip to Mission Control in the main lab, where Uranus pictures were coming in. From looking for dead pixels, I had developed a talent for finding the elusive. I noticed a small blob of bright pixels moving only slightly in an arc between pictures. Later, when we got the orbital elements for the moons discovered by Voyager, the one named Portia had been in the spot where I had watched the moving pixels that night. Unfortunately, Voyager-Uranus encounter was overshadowed by the Challenger accident 4 days later. The fallout from the investigation and the politics surrounding the event contributed to Jim's disillusionment with NASA. That, along with Bob's transfer to the antenna group, began a domino effect ending in the demise of the computer graphics lab. By January 1989, Jim had completed his move to Caltech for Project Mathematics. It felt lonely making Voyager Neptune animation. Closest encounter was August 25, 1989. The exciting part was moving space to PCs, where we produced frames on demand for live broadcast in JPL's Blue Room. In making Voyager Journey to the Outer Planets for SIGGRAPH Electronic Theater at the end of July, I included a retrospective as well as part of the new Neptune footage, ending with the most recent shot of Neptune, received the Sunday before the show opened on Tuesday. SIGGRAPH was the first public showing of a real image of Neptune. That video reflects where we had been and where we wanted to go, combining observed data and theoretical data to benefit research and education. By September of 1990, I was the only one left who knew all the components keeping the lab together, and we became the unfortunate target of a hostile takeover by IPL. In the end, they wanted our charter and projects, but none of our people, equipment, or expertise. The 5 years I predicted before JPL would be able to again do what we had done stretched to 10 years before scientifically accurate simulations were again produced.
So I want to make a couple of closing comments, and then I'm going to show the last 2.5-minute movie, which sort of summarizes the history of the JPL Graphics Lab. This history project is an official project of the Computer History Museum, and will be it'll be on exhibit there, as we say in software terms, real soon now. You can track the progress of what's happening with the history project at our website, and there's a lot of stuff to do, especially collecting and collating things. We're always looking for interns or volunteers. So I'd like to thank David and Jim for dredging up all these memories and putting together a presentation, and Sylvie for doing the same. This is contact information for the people on the panel. Here at SIGGRAPH, everyone's walking around with a NASA lapel pin. Well, not everyone. I mean, the alumni of the Computer Graphics Lab are walking around with this NASA lapel pin pinned onto their bodies somewhere. Somebody's going to ask, why didn't I do ribbons? I tried. It's like ribbons are just gone from the marketplace these days. For Q&A, we'll be around, and Sylvie is available on FaceTime. So let me switch to, where are these cables? Yeah, but I need to get the other movie. Escape. Where's escape? There.
Tower 1, sync, sir. Go ahead.
1, 0, and liftoff.
We're seeing the structures, we're seeing surface characteristics which we had really not even imagined.
This was quite an interesting discovery. It was one that we thought we might find.
Command center for the Deep Space Mission, which in the past few days has carried the eyes of men farther than they've ever been.
And the science is pushed in an amazing fashion. It's like fitting a jigsaw puzzle together.
It's a difficult measurement to make, but we've done it.
The spacecraft is now speeding away from that planet at 33,609 miles per hour.
How do you generate a magnetic field of a planet? Briefly, you do it by having an electrical current flow inside the planet.
Now it's clear that low energy plasma interacts with satellites in some way.
Consumables are great, and we're all set to keep going.
Right over the top of the planet, within about 2,000 miles or so, will be the last object the Voyagers will visit. Voyager 2 will visit in the solar system, and it could be the most unusual one yet. And then down behind Neptune, it'll be a spectacular flyby. Within about 10,000 kilometers of the moon Triton. Well, I know where I'm going to be in August of '89. I hope you do too.
What number?
2. For some of the videos I didn't get a chance to show, you can take a look at youtube.com/Caltech, or also youtube.com and search for CG Time Machine, or you can look at my website and there's direct links to some of those as well.
Thanks for coming. Stacy. Don't forget, I said quiz time now.